Blood trickled down Zoe's cheek as the flight attendant's handprint reddened against her dark skin. The cabin fell silent. 20 years building an empire worth billions, yet still treated like garbage. Zoe Montgomery straightened her Armani suit. Tonight, she wouldn't just buy this airline. She'd destroy it. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you're ready to witness how a moment of discrimination turned into an epic tale of justice, hit that like button and subscribe now. You won't want to miss what happens next when underestimating someone becomes the biggest mistake of this flight attendant's career. Zoe Montgomery had not always been a name that commanded respect in boardrooms across America. At 42, her journey from the projects of Harlem to the pinnacle of the tech world was nothing short of extraordinary. Born to a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, Zoe learned early that the world would not hand her anything because of her skin color, quite the opposite. "Mama, I fixed Mrs. Johnson's computer again," 10-year-old Zoe announced proudly one evening, clutching a $20 bill that felt like a fortune. Darlene Montgomery smiled tiredly, her uniform still on after a 12-hour shift as a hospital orderly. "That's my girl. Always using that beautiful brain of yours." By 12, Zoe had built her first program, a simple scheduling app that helped her mother organize her chaotic work schedule. The local library became her sanctuary, where she devoured every book on programming she could find. The librarian, an older white woman named Barbara, initially watched her suspiciously until she realized this young black girl wasn't there to cause trouble but to absorb knowledge like a sponge. "You're special, Zoe," Barbara told her one day, slipping her an application for a coding camp. "This program offers scholarships. Promise me you'll apply." That camp changed everything. Despite being the only black girl there, Zoe outperformed everyone. The instructor, amazed by her natural talent, recommended her for a specialized high school program. High school brought new challenges. Her classmates, predominantly white and wealthy, made assumptions about how she'd gotten in. Affirmative action case, she overheard one boy whisper. Zoe responded by graduating as valedictorian. MIT came next, where the pattern continued. Professors overlooked her raised hand in favor of her white male classmates. Group projects found her doing most of the work while others got the credit. Once, after presenting a revolutionary algorithm she developed, a professor asked, "Who helped you with this?" The implication was clear. A black woman couldn't possibly have created something so innovative independently. "No one, sir," she'd responded, chin held high. "This is entirely my work. I'd be happy to walk you through every line of code." During her junior year, Zoe created the foundation of what would become NeuroSync, an adaptive AI system that could learn and evolve based on user interaction. While other tech companies were still figuring out basic machine learning, Zoe was already 10 steps ahead, envisioning AI that could anticipate needs rather than simply respond to commands. After graduation, the rejections came swiftly. Venture capitalists would listen to her pitch with interest until she walked into the room. Suddenly, her idea was too ambitious or not market-ready. One particularly honest investor told her, "Look, you're brilliant, but our investors aren't ready to put millions behind someone who looks like you." Undeterred, Zoe bootstrapped her company, taking consulting jobs during the day and building NeuroSync at night. Her first office was her mother's kitchen table. Her first employee was her college roommate, Whitney, who believed in Zoe's vision when no one else did. The breakthrough came when Zoe developed an AI assistant that major phone manufacturers couldn't ignore. Unlike existing virtual assistants, NeuroSync's product adapted to individual speech patterns, accents, and even emotional states. Suddenly, the same investors who had shown her the door were calling incessantly. "I'm not interested," Zoe told them coolly. "But I am willing to consider strategic partnerships, on my terms." By 35, NeuroSync had revolutionized not just consumer technology but healthcare, education, and industrial systems. Zoe's net worth hit $1 billion, making her one of the few black female billionaires in the world. By 40, that number had multiplied tenfold. Despite her wealth, Zoe maintained a relatively low profile. She gave generously to educational initiatives in underserved communities but avoided the spotlight. Her mother, now living in a beautiful house Zoe had bought her, remained her closest confidant until her passing 3 years ago. One of Zoe's peculiar habits, which baffled her executive team, was her insistence on occasionally flying commercial rather than using her private jet. "It keeps me grounded," she explained to Gregory Pierce, her chief of staff. "The moment I lose touch with how regular people travel, how they're treated, is the moment I start losing my edge." Gregory, a former military man who had been with Zoe for 7 years, knew better than to argue. He simply arranged for security protocols and made sure he was always on the same flights, usually seated a few rows behind her. "Just a regular Tuesday," Zoe said as she packed a simple overnight bag for her flight from New York to San Francisco. The trip was anything but ordinary. She was finalizing the acquisition of Celestial Holdings, the parent company of Stellar Airways. It was a strategic move that few understood. Why would a tech company want an airline? But Zoe had her reasons. Vertical integration was just the beginning. Her vision involved revolutionizing air travel through AI, making it safer, more efficient, and more equitable. The board members at Celestial had no idea that the casually dressed black woman boarding flight ST-447 was about to become their boss. As Zoe handed her first-class ticket to the gate agent, she had no inkling that this routine flight would become the catalyst for her most public battle yet, not over technology or business strategy, but over something much more fundamental: dignity and respect. Heather Wilson's day had started badly. Her alarm failed to go off, her hot water heater had broken, and her boyfriend had ended their 2-year relationship via text message at 5 a.m. By the time she arrived at JFK for her shift as the lead flight attendant on Stellar Airways flight ST-447 to San Francisco, her mood was thunderous. "You're late, Heather," her supervisor noted as she rushed to the pre-flight briefing. "Traffic was insane," she lied, knowing full well that her 20 minutes of crying in the employee parking lot was the real reason. At 34, Heather had expected more from her life than serving drinks to entitled passengers, but her dream of becoming a pilot had fizzled out due to financial constraints. The blue uniform with its silver wings pin, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume representing her failures. The first-class cabin on this morning's flight was fully booked, mostly with the usual suspects. Middle-aged white businessmen in expensive suits, tapping impatiently on their phones until the last possible moment. Heather could serve this demographic in her sleep. They wanted minimal interaction, strong drinks, and to be left alone, all things she was happy to provide. As boarding continued, Heather noticed a black woman in her mid-40s approaching the first-class cabin. She wore designer jeans, a simple black cashmere sweater, and minimal jewelry, nice clothes, but not the ostentatious display Heather typically associated with first-class passengers. The woman's natural hair was styled in an elegant twist, and her skin was a rich, deep brown that seemed to glow under the cabin lights. "Excuse me," Heather said, intercepting her. "This is the first-class cabin. Economy boarding is from the rear entrance." The woman looked up from her phone, mild surprise registering in her eyes. "I'm aware," she said calmly, extending her boarding pass. "Seat 2A." Heather examined the ticket with more scrutiny than she'd given any other passengers. "Zoe Montgomery," she read aloud, as if testing whether the name matched the woman before her. "That's me," Zoe replied, her voice neutral but with an undercurrent of something Heather couldn't quite place. Was it amusement? Or resignation? "I'll need to see some ID with that," Heather said, though she hadn't asked any other passengers for identification. Without protest, Zoe produced her driver's license. Heather compared the photo to Zoe's face with unnecessary thoroughness before reluctantly stepping aside. "Very well, 2A is on your right." As Zoe stowed her single carry-on bag and settled into her seat, Heather continued her preparations, occasionally glancing at the black woman who seemed so out of place in her mental image of first class. When it came time for the pre-departure beverage service, Heather's approach to Zoe was noticeably different than with other passengers. "Something to drink?" she asked curtly, without the "would you care for," or "may I offer you," preamble she'd used with others. "Sparkling water with lime, please," Zoe requested. Heather returned with the drinks tray, serving the white male passengers first despite Zoe having asked before them. When she finally placed Zoe's drink down, she did so carelessly, sloshing water onto the tray table. "Oh, sorry about that," she said, without sounding sorry at all, tossing a cocktail napkin in Zoe's direction rather than wiping up the spill properly. Zoe dabbed at the water herself, her expression revealing nothing. The passenger across the aisle, an older white man in an expensive suit, received a much more solicitous, "Is everything all right with your bourbon, sir? Can I get you anything else?" This pattern continued throughout the meal service. Zoe's food arrived last, her requests for a coffee refill were forgotten, and when she pressed the call button for assistance, Heather took nearly 10 minutes to respond. The disparities were subtle enough that most passengers didn't notice, but glaring to Zoe, who had experienced this kind of treatment all her life, regardless of her wealth or accomplishments. 2 hours into the flight, the situation escalated. Heather was rushing down the aisle with a water pitcher when the plane hit a patch of turbulence. She stumbled slightly, and a substantial amount of ice-cold water splashed directly onto Zoe's lap. "Oh!" Zoe exclaimed, startled by the sudden cold shock. Instead of apologizing, Heather frowned. "You should have had your tray table up during turbulence," she said accusingly. Zoe looked pointedly at her tray table, which was indeed in its upright and locked position. "My tray is up," she said evenly. "And we weren't told to prepare for turbulence." Heather's face reddened. "Well, you must have moved suddenly and bumped my arm." The passenger across from Zoe, who had witnessed the entire incident, spoke up. "Actually, she didn't move at all. I saw what happened." Heather shot the man a look of betrayal before turning back to Zoe. "Let me get you some napkins," she said grudgingly. She returned with a handful of thin cocktail napkins, woefully inadequate for the amount of water soaking Zoe's clothes. As Zoe tried to dry herself, she finally addressed the elephant in the cabin. "I've noticed you've been treating me differently from the other passengers in first class," she said quietly, ensuring only Heather could hear. "I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's inappropriate and discriminatory." Heather's eyes widened. "Excuse me? Are you accusing me of being racist?" "I didn't use that word," Zoe replied calmly. "I simply pointed out a pattern of differential treatment." "Well, I've been nothing but professional," Heather hissed, her voice rising slightly. "Maybe you're just being oversensitive." "Gaslighting me doesn't change what's happening," Zoe said, still maintaining her composure. "I'd like to speak to the purser about this, please." Something in Heather snapped. The stress of her personal life, the perceived challenge to her authority, and now being called out by a passenger she had indeed been treating poorly, it all culminated in a moment of shocking unprofessionalism. "Listen," she said, leaning in close, "I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just throw around accusations because you're having a bad day. People like you always want to make everything about race." "People like me?" Zoe repeated, one eyebrow raised. "You know exactly what I mean," Heather retorted. "Always playing the victim card when things don't go your way." Zoe took out her phone. "I'm going to record this conversation and report it to your management when we land." That was when Heather lost all control. Without thinking, she swung her hand and slapped Zoe across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Blood trickled from the corner of Zoe's mouth where her lip had caught against her teeth. The crimson droplet made a stark contrast against her dark skin. The cabin fell into stunned silence, every passenger frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Heather herself seemed the most shocked of all, her hands still raised, her eyes wide with the sudden realization of what she'd done. Zoe slowly raised her hand to her cheek, touching the spot that was rapidly reddening. Then, with deliberate movements, she took out a handkerchief, dabbed the blood from her lip, and looked Heather directly in the eyes. "You've made a very serious mistake," she said, her voice so quiet that Heather had to lean in to hear it. "And I promise you, the consequences will be proportional." Phones were already out, recording the aftermath. Someone had captured the slap itself. Passengers were murmuring in outrage. And in seat 5C, Gregory Pierce was already making calls that would set in motion a chain of events that would transform Stellar Airways forever. Who would have thought that a routine commercial flight could become the setting for such a dramatic confrontation? If you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination while traveling, comment number 1. If you believe the flight attendant's actions were completely unjustifiable regardless of circumstances, hit that like button right now. And if you're wondering how Zoe is going to respond to this shocking assault, subscribe to find out. What would you do if you were in Zoe's position? Stay silent or make your true power known immediately? What the cabin crew and passengers of Flight ST-447 didn't know was that the slap heard around the first-class cabin had landed on the face of the very woman who was less than 24 hours away from becoming their boss. Zoe Montgomery wasn't just any passenger, she was the CEO and founder of NeuroSync, and she was en route to San Francisco to finalize the acquisition of Celestial Holdings, the parent company that owns Stellar Airways. The irony was almost too perfect. The airline's fate had already been sealed in preliminary agreements and financial transactions. The board meeting tomorrow was largely a formality, the final step in a months-long process. Zoe had chosen to fly Stellar specifically to experience their service firsthand before completing the acquisition. She'd wanted to remain anonymous, to see the authentic customer experience without the special treatment her name would command. Well, she had certainly gotten the authentic experience, just not the one the airline would have chosen to showcase to its incoming owner. 5 rows behind Zoe, Gregory Pierce was already in crisis management mode. At 48, the former Navy SEAL had transitioned into corporate security and had been with Zoe for 7 years. His close-cropped salt and pepper hair and perpetually vigilant eyes gave him an intimidating presence, which he could dial up or down as the situation required. Right now, as he spoke quietly but urgently into his phone, his intensity was at maximum. "Simon, it's happened again," he said to Zoe's head of legal affairs. "Worse than Toronto. Physical this time. I need a team at SFO when we land. And alert Diane to prepare for media management." Gregory had witnessed numerous incidents over the years where Zoe had faced discrimination despite, or sometimes because of, her status. There was the 5-star hotel in Paris that mysteriously lost her reservation despite her platinum membership status. The high-end boutique in Milan where the staff followed her around as if she might steal something, unaware she could buy their entire inventory without blinking. The Toronto incident last year, where a restaurant host had tried to seat her by the kitchen despite her reservation for the best table in the house. Each time, Zoe had handled the situation with grace and strategic precision. Sometimes she revealed her identity, watching realization and horror dawn on the faces of those who had mistreated her. Other times, she worked behind the scenes, ensuring systemic changes without public drama. But this, being physically assaulted on an aircraft, this was unprecedented. Zoe has never been hit before, Gregory thought grimly as he ended his call and began another. This wouldn't be handled quietly. Not this time. His next call was to Maya Thompson, Zoe's brilliant legal counsel who had been with NeuroSync since its early days. Maya, a formidable Harvard-educated attorney who had turned down partnerships at prestigious firms to work with Zoe, would know exactly how to proceed. "Maya, we have a situation," Gregory began, keeping his voice low. "Zoe's been physically assaulted by a Stellar Airways flight attendant." "Yes, the airline we're acquiring." "No, I'm not joking. I need you to meet us at SFO with the full legal team." As Gregory continued making calls, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The purser, a veteran flight attendant named James Holloway, had been summoned by alarmed passengers and was now attempting damage control, his face ashen as he spoke with Zoe. "Ma'am, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this inexcusable incident," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I assure you that Stellar Airways does not condone such behavior under any circumstances. Heather has been removed from cabin duties for the remainder of the flight, and we will be involving law enforcement upon landing." Zoe regarded him coolly. "I appreciate your response, Mr. Holloway. I'll be cooperating fully with any investigation." What James didn't know was that 3 seats behind him, another passenger was texting furiously with the CEO of Stellar Airways. The passenger, a board member of the airline who recognized Zoe Montgomery from a tech conference, had just dropped a bombshell that would send shockwaves through the company's executive ranks. At Stellar Airways headquarters in Chicago, CEO Richard Bennett was in the middle of a budget meeting when his executive assistant burst in without knocking, something she had never done in 5 years of working for him. "Sir, there's an emergency on flight ST-447, she said breathlessly. "A flight attendant has physically assaulted a passenger. It's all over social media already." Richard's first thought was of lawsuits and PR damage. "Who's the passenger?" he asked, already reaching for his phone. "Sir, it's Zoe Montgomery." The blood drained from Richard's face. "Zoe Montgomery? The Zoe Montgomery? The one who's buying us tomorrow?" His assistant nodded grimly. "Get me everything on this now," he barked, ending the meeting with a wave of his hand. "And find out who the flight attendant is. Their career is over." As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, videos of the incident were already circulating online. #Stellar Assault was trending on Twitter. News outlets were picking up the story: Black female passenger slapped by flight attendant, airline faces backlash. What none of the headlines mentioned, yet, was that the passenger in question was about to become the airline's owner. That revelation would come soon enough, and when it did, the story would explode into something much bigger than a single incident of airline misconduct. When Flight ST-447 touched down at San Francisco Airport, it was met by an unusual welcoming committee, airport police, Stellar Airways executives, and a team of sharply dressed individuals who moved with military precision. As passengers disembarked, many were still filming, expecting further drama. They weren't disappointed. Heather Wilson, escorted by airport police, came face to face with Richard Bennett himself in the jet bridge. "Mr. Bennett? What are you doing here?" she asked, confusion evident on her tear-stained face. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed, keeping his voice low but unable to hide his fury. "Do you know who that woman is?" Heather shook her head, bewildered by her CEO's presence and his obvious rage. "That's Zoe Montgomery," he said, watching comprehension fail to dawn in her eyes. "Founder and CEO of NeuroSync. Net worth of over $20 billion. And as of tomorrow morning, the new owner of Stellar Airways." Heather's face went from confusion to shock to horror in the span of seconds. "The owner?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The owner," Richard confirmed grimly. "And you slapped her across the face." As this reality sank in, Zoe emerged from the aircraft, flanked by Gregory and met immediately by Maya and her team. She walked past Richard and Heather without acknowledging them, her focus completely on what would come next. "Maya, I want options," she said as they walked briskly through the terminal. "Not just for the flight attendant. For the entire company culture that allowed this to happen." Maya nodded, already 3 steps ahead. "We've got the acquisition leverage, civil litigation possibilities, criminal assault charges, federal aviation violations, civil rights angles, and public relations aspects all covered. By tomorrow's board meeting, we'll have a comprehensive strategy." "Good," Zoe said simply. "Because this isn't just about one slap. This is about changing the system that made that flight attendant think her actions were acceptable in the first place." As her team escorted her to a waiting car, Zoe's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elaine Carter, her longtime mentor. "Saw the news. Are you okay?" Zoe typed back a simple response, "No. But I will be. And so will everyone who comes after me." The stage was set for a confrontation much bigger than anyone at Stellar Airways could possibly imagine. What had begun as a routine flight was about to become a watershed moment not just for one airline, but for corporate America's reckoning with discrimination at every level. Richard Bennett paced the length of his suite at the Four Seasons San Francisco, his Italian leather shoes wearing an invisible path in the plush carpet. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and the physique of someone who had once been athletic but had succumbed to too many business dinners, he had navigated Stellar Airways through financial crises, labor disputes, and industry upheavals. But nothing in his 25-year career had prepared him for this catastrophe. "How bad is it, Jennifer?" he asked his chief communications officer, who was monitoring the social media firestorm on her laptop. Jennifer Wheeler sighed heavily. "It's gone viral, Richard. Over 7 million views across platforms. Every major news outlet has picked it up. #BoycottStellar is trending nationally. And Montgomery? Any statement from her team? Nothing official. But that silence is deafening and strategic. They're letting the video speak for itself while we scramble." Richard loosened his tie. The acquisition by Neurosync had been his masterpiece, a deal that would inject much-needed capital into the struggling airline while allowing him to exit with a golden parachute before the industry's next inevitable downturn. Now, it was all at risk because one flight attendant couldn't control her prejudices. "Get the board on an emergency call. Now," he ordered. Within 30 minutes, the 11 members of Stellar Airways' board of directors were connected virtually, their faces displaying varying degrees of panic as Richard briefed them on the situation. "This is beyond a PR nightmare," said Victoria Hodge, the board's only woman and one of its 2 non-white members. "This is existential for the brand." "Let's not overreact," countered Thomas Reynolds, a 65-year-old banking executive who had consistently opposed Victoria's diversity initiatives. "It's one isolated incident by a single employee who will obviously be terminated. Montgomery is a businesswoman. She won't let emotions derail a multi-billion-dollar acquisition." Victoria's expression hardened. "With respect, Thomas, that kind of dismissive attitude is exactly what creates environments where incidents like this occur. And you're making a dangerous assumption about how Ms. Montgomery will respond." Before Thomas could retort, Richard interrupted. "The police are involved. The flight attendant, Heather Wilson, could face assault charges. But more immediately concerning, we have the board meeting with Montgomery and her team at 9 tomorrow morning. The question is, what's our approach?" "Full apology, obviously," said CFO Martin Brooks. "Immediate termination of the employee. A substantial settlement offer. And perhaps a commitment to enhanced diversity training." Victoria shook her head. "That's treating the symptom, not the disease. If Montgomery is as smart as her reputation suggests, she'll see through that immediately." "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked with poorly concealed irritation. "A complete overhaul of our hiring practices, leadership composition, and company culture. With concrete metrics and accountability. If we offer anything less, we risk losing this deal entirely." The debate continued for hours, with the board splitting along predictable lines. Eventually, Richard asserted his authority. "Here's what we're going to do. I'll meet with Montgomery personally before the board meeting. Full apology, sincere contrition, Wilson's termination as a given, and openness to whatever additional measures Montgomery wants to discuss. Our priority is salvaging the acquisition." As the call ended, Richard received a text from a contact at San Francisco Police Department. "Wilson released, no charges filed yet. Montgomery declined to press immediate charges but reserved the right to do so later." This unexpected development left Richard even more unsettled. In his experience, when a wronged party declined immediate legal remedy, it usually meant they were planning something much more comprehensive. Across town, in a significantly more luxurious suite at the Ritz-Carlton, Zoe sat surrounded by her core team. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, a visible reminder of the day's events. Maya Thompson, elegant in a tailored suit despite the late hour, was outlining legal options. At 41, Maya had turned down partnership tracks at multiple prestigious firms to work with Zoe, drawn by the chance to create meaningful change rather than just corporate profits. Legally, we're in an unusual position of strength, she explained. We have the assault itself, which is straightforward. But more strategically, we have the acquisition leverage. We can essentially dictate terms at this point. Gregory, standing by the window with the vigilance that never quite left him, nodded. Bennett will be desperate. He knows his own position is at risk, not just the deal. Zoe sipped her tea thoughtfully. What's the status of our ownership position? Diana Chen, Zoe's razor-sharp chief investment officer, consulted her tablet. Through various investment vehicles, we effectively control 23% of Celestial Holdings stock. The acquisition would give us controlling interest, but even without it, we're the largest single shareholder. We have significant influence regardless of tomorrow's outcome. And the video? Zoe asked, turning to Amara Johnson, her head of communications. 15 million views and climbing, Amara reported. We've made no official statement, but I've quietly ensured that key journalists know you're the buyer behind the Stellar acquisition. That connection will hit the morning news cycle. Zoe nodded, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. I've faced discrimination my entire life. As a child in Harlem. As a student at MIT. As a founder seeking investment. As a billionaire who still gets followed around in luxury stores. She touched her cheek gently. But this is the first time it's escalated to physical assault. And it happened in a confined space, at 30,000 feet, by someone with authority over the cabin. Her team listened intently, recognizing that Zoe was working through her strategy aloud. This isn't just about me, she continued. It's about every person of color who's been made to feel less than human while just trying to exist in spaces they have every right to occupy. I could ruin this flight attendant's life with one word. I could walk away from the acquisition and watch Stellar's stock plummet. But neither of those actions creates lasting change. Maya leaned forward. What are you thinking? A hint of the strategic brilliance that had built Neurosync flashed in Zoe's eyes. I'm thinking it's time for a different approach to accountability. One that transforms rather than punishes. One that creates a template other companies will be forced to follow. As Zoe outlined her plan, her team's expressions shifted from surprise to admiration. It was bold, unexpected, and quintessentially Zoe, leveraging power not just for retribution, but for reconstruction. The next morning, Richard Bennett arrived at Stellar's San Francisco offices 90 minutes before the scheduled board meeting. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios and desperate strategies. His assistant met him with a stack of newspapers and printouts of online headlines: Tech billionaire slapped by airline staff on eve of acquisition, Stellar Airways faces crisis as CEO assaulted by flight attendant Zoe Montgomery, from slapped passenger to airline owner in 24 hours, coffee, strong, Richard muttered, retreating to his office to prepare for what might be the most important meeting of his career. At precisely 8:55 a.m., the receptionist announced Zoe's arrival. Rather than waiting to be escorted to the boardroom, Zoe and her team, Gregory, Maya, Diana, and Amara, walked directly to Richard's office. The power move was subtle but clear. This was no longer his territory to control. Richard stood as they entered, extending his hand automatically before noticing the bruise on Zoe's face and faltering visibly. Ms. Montgomery, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what happened, he began, his practiced contrition sounding hollow even to his own ears. Zoe regarded him coolly. Mr. Bennett, we have a board meeting in 5 minutes where we'll discuss this thoroughly. I'd prefer to keep this interaction professional and focused on the business at hand. Richard nodded, wrong-footed by her composure. He had expected anger, demands, perhaps even tears. Instead, he faced the same brilliant strategist who had outmaneuvered far more formidable opponents than him. Of course, he managed. "Shall we proceed to the boardroom?" "One moment," Zoe said. "I understand Heather Wilson is in the building?" Richard froze. "Yes. HR is processing her termination paperwork. I want her in the board meeting." "I'm sorry. You heard me correctly. The flight attendant who assaulted me. I want her present for this discussion." Richard began to protest but stopped when he saw the resolute expression on Zoe's face. With a sense of foreboding, he instructed his assistant to bring Heather to the meeting. When they entered the boardroom, the assembled board members rose awkwardly. Introductions were made, tension thick in the air. Zoe took the seat at the head of the table, Richard's usual place, another subtle assertion of the shifting power dynamic. 5 minutes into the meeting, as Maya was outlining the adjusted terms of the acquisition, the door opened and Heather Wilson entered, escorted by a nervous HR representative. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her usual confidence replaced by visible terror as she recognized Zoe. "Ms. Wilson, please take a seat," Zoe said, gesturing to an empty chair directly across from her. Heather sat stiffly, looking like she might bolt at any moment. "Now," said Zoe, addressing the entire room, "let's discuss the future of Stellar Airways, and the true cost of discrimination in corporate America." The Stellar Airways boardroom had hosted countless tense negotiations over the years, but nothing compared to the electric atmosphere as Zoe Montgomery locked eyes with Heather Wilson across the polished mahogany table. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark, Zoe in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Heather's annual salary, radiating calm authority despite the bruise on her cheek. Heather in her rumpled Stellar Airways uniform, her hands trembling slightly as she realized the full magnitude of her situation. "For those who haven't connected the dots yet," Zoe began, her voice measured and clear, "yesterday on Stellar Airways Flight ST-447, Ms. Wilson here physically assaulted me following a pattern of discriminatory treatment throughout the flight. What she didn't know, what none of the crew knew, was that I was traveling to San Francisco to finalize NeuroSync's acquisition of Celestial Holdings, the parent company of this airline." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas Reynolds, notorious for his resistance to diversity initiatives, couldn't quite hide his scowl. "Ms. Montgomery," Richard Bennett interjected, desperation evident in his voice, "I want to assure you that Ms. Wilson's actions in no way reflect the values or policies of Stellar Airways. She has been terminated, effective immediately, and we are prepared to offer substantial compensation." Zoe raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate your attempt at damage control, but let's be honest with each other. Ms. Wilson's actions didn't occur in a vacuum. They were enabled by a corporate culture that tolerates bias, even if it doesn't explicitly endorse it." She turned her attention back to Heather, who seemed to be shrinking into her chair. "Ms. Wilson, would you explain to the board why you felt it was appropriate to slap me?" Heather's eyes widened in panic. She had expected to be fired, possibly arrested, not asked to explain herself to the very woman she had assaulted, surrounded by the company's highest executives. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "It was unprofessional and inexcusable. I was having a terrible day, and I just snapped." "A terrible day," Zoe repeated thoughtfully. "I see. And would you have snapped in the same way if I had been white?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unavoidable. "I'm not racist," Heather said reflexively, the standard defense that Zoe had heard countless times. "I have black friends." "I never meant to." "Let me stop you there," Zoe interrupted, her tone still even but with an underlying steel. "This isn't about whether you consciously hate black people. It's about the unconscious biases that led you to assume I didn't belong in first class, to provide inferior service compared to my white fellow passengers, and ultimately to feel entitled to put your hands on me." Maya Thompson slid a folder across the table. We've compiled statements from 8 passengers who observed Ms. Wilson's behavior throughout the flight. All noted the disparate treatment, even before the physical assault. Heather's face crumpled. I didn't realize. I never thought of myself as. That's precisely the problem, Zoe said. Most discrimination isn't carried out by people twirling villainous mustaches and explicitly announcing their prejudice. It's perpetrated by ordinary people who don't examine their biases or the systems that reinforce them. Richard Bennett, sensing the acquisition slipping away, tried again. MS. Montgomery, we acknowledge there may be room for improvement in our corporate culture. We're prepared to implement whatever diversity training programs you recommend. Diversity training programs, Thomas Reynolds muttered under his breath, rolling his eyes slightly. Zoe caught the gesture and turned her attention to him. You have something to add, Mr. Reynolds? Caught, Reynolds straightened in his chair. I simply think we're making rather a lot out of an isolated incident. One employee's regrettable actions hardly indict our entire corporate culture. Victoria Hodge, the board's diversity advocate, couldn't contain herself. Thomas, I've brought documented evidence of systemic issues to this board 6 times in the past 3 years. Each time, you've blocked meaningful action, calling it unnecessary expense or political correctness gone mad. Because it is. Reynolds retorted, his mask of corporate decorum slipping. The airline industry runs on razor-thin margins. We can't afford to prioritize social engineering over operational efficiency. The room fell silent as everyone realized he had just handed Zoe exactly what she needed. Social engineering, Zoe repeated, her voice dangerously soft. Is that what you call creating an environment where all customers are treated with equal respect regardless of their skin color? Where employees understand that physical assault isn't an appropriate response to stress? Fascinating perspective, Mr. Reynolds. She opened her tablet and slid it toward Richard. These are my terms for proceeding with the acquisition. They're non-negotiable. Richard scanned the document, his face growing paler with each swipe. This is extensive. It's necessary, Zoe corrected. Complete overhaul of hiring practices. Bias training for all employees, with regular refresher courses. A diverse leadership pipeline program. Independent oversight of customer complaint resolution with specific attention to discrimination claims. And a restructuring of the board to better reflect the diversity of your customer base. Thomas Reynolds erupted. This is absurd. You're using one incident as leverage to force a radical agenda on a company you don't even own yet. Zoe turned to Maya, who calmly interjected, actually, through various investment vehicles, NeuroSync already controls 23% of Celestial Holdings stock, making us the largest shareholder. Even without completing the acquisition, we have significant influence over company direction. And let's be clear, Zoe added, if we walk away from this deal, Stellar's stock will plummet when the market learns why. Your choice is simple. Embrace meaningful change or face financial consequences. Richard Bennett, seeing his golden parachute evaporating, tried a different approach. Ms. Montgomery, while we appreciate your position, these changes would take years to implement. Perhaps we could agree to a more gradual approach. My face was gradual enough, Zoe replied, touching her bruised cheek. The time for incremental change has passed. Throughout this exchange, Heather had remained silent, watching the corporate drama unfold around her, a drama she had unwittingly initiated with one impulsive act. Now, she spoke up, her voice small but determined. Can I say something? All eyes turned to her, many surprised she was still in the room. I know I've lost my job, and I deserve that. What I did was wrong, not just professionally but morally. She looked directly at Zoe. I've spent all night thinking about why I did it, really thinking about it for the first time. And the truth is uncomfortable. I did treat you differently. I did make assumptions based on how you look. I did feel more entitled to express my frustration with you than I would have with other passengers. Tears welled in her eyes, but she continued. I'm not saying this to ask for my job back or to escape consequences. I'm saying it because it's true, and because maybe hearing it might help these people understand that this isn't just about one bad employee. It's about what we consider normal, what we let slide, what we don't even notice ourselves doing. The boardroom fell silent. Zoe studied Heather thoughtfully before turning back to Richard. My terms stand. You have until the end of business today to accept them, or Neurosync walks away and begins divesting our existing shares in Celestial Holdings. She rose from her chair, her team following suit. And as for Ms. Wilson, Heather braced herself. I'm not pressing criminal charges. Not because what you did wasn't criminal, but because I don't believe the criminal justice system is the right remedy for every wrong. Instead, if this acquisition proceeds, you'll be the first participant in Stellar's new accountability and education program. Confusion replaced fear on Heather's face. I don't understand. Rather than simply firing employees who display discriminatory behavior, we'll offer an alternative path, intensive education on the history and impact of systemic racism, coupled with community service work with organizations serving marginalized communities. Those who complete the program successfully will be considered for reinstatement. You'd give me a second chance? Heather asked incredulously. Not me, Zoe clarified. The program will have independent administrators. But yes, the opportunity would exist. Permanent exclusion rarely creates lasting change. Transformation is more powerful than punishment. As Zoe and her team prepared to leave, Thomas Reynolds made one last desperate attempt. The shareholders will never approve this level of upheaval based on one incident. Zoe paused at the door. One incident caught on camera, Mr. Reynolds. But Maya has compiled a dossier of 217 discrimination complaints filed against Stellar Airways in the past 5 years, most of which were dismissed without serious investigation. If I need to take this public to achieve shareholder support, I will. With that, she left the stunned boardroom, leaving Richard Bennett to confront the reality that his company's future, and his own, now depended on embracing the very changes he had spent years avoiding. As the door closed behind them, Gregory leaned close to Zoe. That went exactly as you predicted. People are predictable when they're defensive, Zoe replied. Now we wait to see if self-interest will drive them toward progress. By mid-afternoon, Richard Bennett's assistant called to schedule a follow-up meeting. The board had voted 7-4 to accept Zoe's terms. The transformation of Stellar Airways was about to begin. Is this story resonating with you? Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their appearance? Comment number 1 if you believe Zoe's approach to transformation rather than punishment is the right path. Hit that like button if you think corporate America needs more leaders willing to demand real accountability. What do you think will happen next? Will the board members truly embrace change, or are they plotting something behind the scenes? Subscribe now to find out as this story takes an unexpected turn. Despite the board's official acceptance of Zoe's terms, not everyone at Stellar Airways was prepared to surrender without a fight. In a private dining room at San Francisco's exclusive Olympic Club, Thomas Reynolds hosted an unofficial meeting with 4 other board members and several senior executives who shared his opposition to the changes Zoe demanded. This is nothing short of a hostile takeover disguised as social justice, Thomas fumed, swirling his 18-year-old scotch. At 65, with thinning white hair and the ruddy complexion of privilege, he represented the old guard of corporate America, men who had risen through the ranks when diversity meant having an occasional woman in the secretarial pool. She's using one unfortunate incident as leverage to impose an entire agenda, agreed Harold Blackstone, Stellar's chief operations officer. These programs she's demanding will cost millions and disrupt operations for years. Victoria Chan, who had been invited as the token representative of the pro-change faction, raised an eyebrow. An unfortunate incident? A Stellar employee physically assaulted a passenger based on racial prejudice. In what world is that merely unfortunate? No one is defending Wilson's actions, Thomas said dismissively. But Montgomery's response is disproportionate and opportunistic. It's also legally binding, given the board vote this afternoon, Victoria pointed out. This discussion seems rather pointless. Thomas smiled thinly. Votes can be reconsidered. Agreements can be modified. Montgomery may have won this battle, but the war for Stellar's soul isn't over. What exactly are you suggesting? Victoria asked, her discomfort evident. A multi-pronged strategy, Thomas replied. First, we slow-walk implementation of these changes, citing operational complexities and budget constraints. Second, we manage public perception to paint Montgomery as an angry, vindictive woman using one employee's mistake to seize control. Third, we build a coalition of shareholders concerned about the costs of these reforms, and their impact on quarterly returns. You're talking about systematic obstruction of a board-approved initiative, Victoria said, her voice sharp. That borders on breaching your fiduciary duty. I prefer to think of it as protecting the company's long-term interests from short-term reactive decisions, Thomas countered smoothly. Are you with us, Victoria, or should we continue this discussion without you? Victoria glanced around the table, noting the determined faces of the old guard, then stood up. I think I've heard enough. Good evening, gentlemen. As she left, Thomas turned to the remaining conspirators. We need to move quickly. Montgomery may anticipate resistance. Meanwhile, across town, Gregory Pierce was proving Thomas right. In a secure room at NeuroSync's San Francisco office, he was briefing Zoe on intelligence gathered from within Stellar. We've identified 5 board members and 8 executives who are actively organizing resistance, he reported, displaying profiles on a large screen. Reynolds is the ringleader, as expected. And Victoria Chang? Zoe asked. She attended their first meeting but left early. Our source indicates she was uncomfortable with their approach. She may become an ally. Zoe nodded, unsurprised. What's their strategy? 3-pronged. Administrative delay tactics, public relations campaign against you, and shareholder pressure based on implementation costs. Maya Thompson, who had been reviewing documents in the corner, looked up. Predictable but potentially effective, especially the shareholder angle. We should counter-strategize immediately. Already in progress, Zoe assured her. Diana has been meeting with institutional investors who hold significant Celestial stock. Many are already aligned with our environmental, social, and governance priorities and see this as a positive development. And the PR front? Amara Johnson asked, always focused on communication strategy. We let them throw the first punch, Zoe decided. When they try to paint me as an angry black woman, they'll activate precisely the stereotypes we're challenging. Their own tactics will undermine their credibility. That leaves the administrative delays, Gregory noted. How do we counter institutional foot-dragging? Zoe smiled. By being better prepared than they expect. Maya, show them. Maya opened her laptop and displayed a comprehensive implementation plan. We've been developing this for months, anticipating potential resistance. It includes detailed protocols, budget projections, training modules, and measurable outcomes, all customized for the airline industry and Stellar specifically. They're expecting vague demands they can easily defer, Zoe explained. Instead, they'll receive a turnkey solution with timeline benchmarks and performance metrics. Any delay will be obviously intentional rather than practical. As the team continued strategizing, across the city, Thomas Reynolds' group was already putting their plan into action. Harold Blackstone had tasked his communications team with compiling a dossier on Zoe, seeking any leverage they could use to discredit her. Find anything we can use, he instructed. Past conflicts, disgruntled employees, personal scandals, anything that suggests a pattern of overreaction or vendettas. The team worked through the night but found frustratingly little. Zoe's public image was nearly impeccable. Her private life was carefully guarded. Former employees generally spoke highly of her, and NeuroSync's corporate culture was frequently cited as a model of inclusion and innovation. By morning, Harold had only a thin folder of potential angles, most too weak to be effective. "She's too clean," he admitted to Thomas over breakfast. "The best we've got is trying to frame her as using racial issues opportunistically to further her business interests." "Then that's our angle," Thomas decided. "We portray her as exploiting this incident for financial gain, weaponizing identity politics to force concessions that benefit NeuroSync at Stellar's expense." The first salvo came that afternoon, when an opinion piece appeared in a prominent business publication, "When Social Justice Meets Corporate Raiders, The Troubling Tactics of Zoe Montgomery." The article, written by a conservative commentator with ties to Thomas Reynolds, questioned whether Montgomery was exploiting legitimate concerns about discrimination to execute a predatory takeover. Zoe read the piece calmly in her hotel suite, then passed it to Amara. "Right on schedule," she noted. "Predictable angle, too. Want me to prepare a response?" Amara asked. "Not directly," Zoe replied. "But alert our media contacts that I'll be speaking at the Urban League dinner tomorrow night. It's time to control the narrative." The next attack came from within Stellar itself. An internal memo, ostensibly analyzing the financial impact of Zoe's required changes, was strategically leaked to the financial press. The memo, commissioned by Thomas and deliberately pessimistic in its projections, suggested the new programs would cost upwards of $50 million and could impact Stellar's already thin profit margins for years to come. The leak achieved its intended effect. Celestial Holdings stock dipped 3% as investors reacted to the projected costs. Thomas was quick to capitalize, calling several major institutional investors to express concerns about the financial wisdom of Montgomery's demands. What Thomas didn't know was that Gregory had infiltrated his inner circle. One of the executives Thomas believed was aligned with his resistance was actually reporting every move back to Zoe's team. And now, Gregory had uncovered something that would change everything. "We've got him," Gregory announced, entering Zoe's suite with a flash drive. "Thomas Reynolds has been systematically burying discrimination complaints at Stellar for years." Maya's eyes widened. "How systematically?" "He established a special HR protocol for what he called sensitive complaints, basically anything involving allegations of racism, sexism, or other discrimination by high-value customers or senior staff. These complaints were routed directly to his office, where most were dismissed or settled with minimal NDAs. "And we have documentation?" Zoe asked. Gregory nodded grimly. "Complete records for the past 7 years. Over 300 complaints effectively buried, including 17 that involved physical contact or threats." "This isn't just unethical," Maya said, reviewing the files. "It potentially violates federal employment law and SEC disclosure requirements for a public company." Zoe considered this information carefully. "We don't use this yet. Let Reynolds continue thinking he's winning. We'll present this at precisely the right moment." That moment came sooner than expected. Thomas, emboldened by what he perceived as successful countermeasures, called an emergency board meeting to reconsider the scope and timeline of the changes Zoe had demanded. His confidence was further boosted when Richard Bennett, sensing the shifting winds, began to align himself with the resistance. The board reconvened 48 hours after their initial vote, with Thomas prepared to make his case for a more measured, fiscally responsible approach to addressing Stellar's cultural issues. Zoe and her team were invited as a courtesy, with Thomas assuming they would be on the defensive. As the meeting began, Thomas took control immediately. "Fellow board members, while we all agree that Ms. Wilson's actions were reprehensible, new financial analysis suggests the Montgomery protocols would place undue strain on our operational capacity. I move that we establish a committee to develop a more sustainable implementation plan over a 5-year period rather than the 12 months currently proposed." Several board members nodded in agreement. Richard Bennett, sensing an opportunity to reassert control, quickly seconded the motion. "Before we vote," Zoe said calmly, I think the board should be aware of some relevant information that may impact your decision." Thomas smiled condescendingly. "Ms. Montgomery, while we value your input, this is an internal board matter concerning implementation timelines, not a reconsideration of our commitment to improvement." "I understand," Zoe replied, her voice measured. "However, this information directly relates to the company's existing processes for handling discrimination complaints, which contextualizes the urgency of our proposed timeline." She nodded to Maya, who distributed folders to each board member. "These documents detail a systematic process within Stellar Airways to intercept, minimize, and suppress discrimination complaints over the past 7 years. The protocol was established and overseen by Mr. Reynolds, without full board knowledge or approval." The color drained from Thomas's face as he flipped through the meticulously documented evidence. Other board members gasped or murmured as they reviewed the damning information. "This is a serious violation of board governance," Victoria Chang said, breaking the stunned silence. "And potentially illegal. This is an invasion of confidential company records." Thomas sputtered, attempting to regain control. "These documents were obtained illegally and cannot be considered by this board." "Actually," Maya interjected smoothly, "these records were provided by a whistleblower within Stellar's HR department who was concerned about potential legal liability. Their disclosure is protected under federal whistleblower statutes." Richard Bennett, realizing the ground had shifted dramatically, attempted to distance himself from Thomas. "I had no knowledge of this protocol. The board was never informed of this process." "Precisely the problem," Zoe stated. "Stellar has had an unofficial policy of suppressing exactly the kind of issues our reforms aim to address. This isn't about one flight attendant who slapped a passenger. It's about a corporate culture that systematically devalued the experiences of people of color, both employees and customers." She let the implications sink in before continuing. "Now, the board faces a choice. You can align with Mr. Reynolds and continue fighting necessary change, potentially triggering federal investigations into these suppressed complaints. Or you can commit fully to the transformation process we've outlined, which includes amnesty provisions for past systemic issues provided there's full commitment to change going forward." The boardroom fell silent as the magnitude of the decision became clear. Thomas Reynolds had made a fatal miscalculation. By fighting so hard to maintain the status quo, he had exposed the very rot that Zoe had sensed but couldn't previously prove. One by one, board members who had been leaning toward Thomas's position began shifting their support to Zoe's original plan. Even Richard Bennett, ever the survivor, quickly pivoted. "In light of this disturbing information, I believe we must recommit to the full and timely implementation of MS. Montgomery's proposed changes," Richard announced, as if he hadn't been supporting Thomas's obstruction minutes earlier. Thomas, seeing his support evaporate, made one last desperate attempt. "This is nothing but corporate blackmail. Montgomery is threatening this board with selective disclosure of confidential information to force her agenda." "No, Mr. Reynolds," Zoe replied calmly. "This is accountability. Something that's been sorely lacking at Stellar Airways. And now, I'd like to call for a vote of no confidence in Mr. Reynolds' continued service on this board." The vote was 9-2. Thomas Reynolds' tenure at Stellar Airways ended that afternoon, marking the first concrete step in the company's transformation. As he stormed out of the boardroom, the remaining members turned to Zoe with a new understanding. She hadn't been bluffing, and she was always several steps ahead. The resistance had been not just defeated but exposed for what it truly was, not fiscal prudence or corporate pragmatism, but the last gasping defense of a system that could no longer justify its existence. The victory over Thomas Reynolds and his allies should have felt triumphant. Zoe had outmaneuvered the opposition, secured the board's renewed commitment to transformation, and removed the primary obstacle to meaningful change at Stellar Airways. Yet, as she stood on the balcony of her penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton that evening, watching San Francisco's lights shimmer across the bay, Zoe felt a familiar emptiness settle over her. 42 floors above the city, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability that few ever witnessed. She touched the fading bruise on her cheek and felt the weight of not just this battle, but all the battles that had preceded it throughout her life. The constant vigilance. The need to be twice as prepared, twice as poised, twice as strategic as her white counterparts. The exhaustion of navigating spaces never designed to welcome her. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from her team. They had dispersed after the board meeting, everyone understanding that Zoe needed space. Gregory had stationed himself discreetly in the suite's living room, respecting her privacy while ensuring her security, an arrangement they had perfected over years. Among the messages was one from her old friend Whitney, who had been with NeuroSync from the beginning. Saw the news. You okay? Really okay? Zoe appreciated that Whitney knew to ask twice. To those who didn't truly know her, Zoe Montgomery was unflappable, a force of nature who had built a tech empire through sheer brilliance and determination. Few understood the toll it took to maintain that facade. She texted back simply, "Getting there." The truth was more complicated. Each victory like today's came with a price, one paid in private moments like this, when the armor could finally come off and the accumulated stress, anger, and hurt could be acknowledged. Zoe's thoughts drifted to key moments in her journey. Her first pitch to venture capitalists, when she'd worn her mother's gold earrings for luck, only to be asked if she was the assistant when she walked into the room. The MIT professor who suggested her groundbreaking algorithm must have been copied from somewhere. The luxury condo seller who had insisted on seeing proof of funds before even showing her properties. Each incident had required a careful calculation: when to confront, when to strategically retreat, when to educate, when to simply endure and move forward. These constant calculations consumed mental and emotional energy that her white colleagues never had to expend. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Elaine Carter. At 73, Elaine had been a pioneering black woman in computer science long before the field had any semblance of diversity. She had mentored Zoe since MIT, becoming a surrogate mother figure after Darlene Montgomery's passing. If anyone understood what Zoe was experiencing, it was Elaine. "I was wondering when you'd call," Zoe said, answering the phone. "I've been watching the news," Elaine replied, her voice carrying the warm timbre and slight southern accent that always made Zoe feel grounded. "That Reynolds man didn't know what hit him." Zoe smiled despite herself. "He made it too easy. Classic mistake of underestimating his opponent." Elaine hummed knowingly. "But that's not why I'm calling. I'm checking on you, Zoe. The real you, not the CEO who just outmaneuvered a boardroom full of old white men." The simple acknowledgement of her humanity, something so often overlooked in the narratives about her, brought unexpected tears to Zoe's eyes. "I'm tired, Elaine," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "So damn tired." "I know, baby. I know. It never stops. No matter what I achieve, how much money I make, how many companies I build or acquire, I still walk into spaces where the first thing people see is a black woman who doesn't belong. And now one of them put their hands on you," Elaine said, naming the trauma that Zoe had been professionally processing but not personally acknowledging. "Yes." The word came out choked. "Being hit changes things," Elaine said softly. "It crosses a line. Makes the abstract concrete in a way that's visceral." Zoe closed her eyes, feeling the truth of those words. "I keep thinking about my mother. How many indignities she endured without the shield of wealth or power. How she kept her humanity intact despite it all." "Darlene was exceptional," Elaine agreed. "But she would also be the first to tell you that you don't have to carry every battle alone. That's what systems of oppression want, for us to feel isolated in our struggles." "I know that intellectually," Zoe sighed. "But this feels personal in a way that's hard to share." "Which is precisely why you need to share it," Elaine countered. "Your wealth can shield you from many things, Zoe, but not from the fundamental question every black person in America faces: can money and success ever truly protect us from racism? The question hung in the air, weighty and unresolved. "What do you think?" Zoe finally asked. "I think wealth and status can mitigate some effects and amplify others. They can give you the power to fight back, as you're doing with Stellar Airways. But they can't erase the reality or the trauma. Sometimes they just change the nature of the barriers." Zoe thought about this. "The higher I climb, the more isolated the experience becomes. Fewer people who understand, fewer spaces to be vulnerable. That's by design," Elaine reminded her. "Systems maintain themselves by isolating those who challenge them. Your power threatens the status quo, so they try to ensure you feel alone in your experiences." A knock at the balcony door interrupted them. Gregory stood there, apologetic but insistent. "I'm sorry, but there's a situation that needs your attention," he said. "I should go," Zoe told Elaine. "Remember what I said," Elaine replied. "You're fighting the good fight, but don't let it consume you. Your mother would be proud, but she'd also tell you to protect your spirit." After ending the call, Zoe turned to Gregory. "What's happening?" "Thomas Reynolds is going nuclear," he reported. "He's given an interview to the Wall Street Journal, claiming you orchestrated the entire incident, including the slap, as a pretext for taking control of Stellar." Zoe stared at him incredulously. "That's absurd. It gets worse. He's suggesting you have a history of similar tactics, positioning yourself as a victim to gain business advantages. The accusation was so outlandish it would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. This was the ultimate gaslighting, claiming she had somehow engineered her own assault for financial gain. He's desperate," Zoe noted, her strategic mind already processing countermoves. "And sloppy. This can be turned against him." Gregory nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "There's something else. I'm worried about you, Zoe. You haven't really stopped since the incident. No real rest, no processing time." Few people could speak to Zoe with such directness. Gregory had earned that right through years of loyalty and genuine care for her well-being beyond his professional obligations. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "With respect, you're not," he countered gently. "And you don't need to be. No one would be fine after being assaulted and then immediately navigating a corporate takeover while fending off racist attempts to undermine them." His assessment was so accurate it momentarily took her breath away. She'd been so focused on the strategic chess game, on not showing weakness, that she'd barely acknowledged the human impact of what she'd experienced. "What do you suggest?" she asked, not defensively but with genuine curiosity. "Take 24 hours. Just for yourself. Let the team handle Reynolds and his desperate flailing. The foundation is laid, the transformation is happening. One day won't change that." The suggestion was so contrary to Zoe's usual approach that her instinct was to dismiss it immediately. She never stepped back in the middle of a crucial negotiation. But Elaine's words echoed in her mind, "Don't let it consume you." "Maybe you're right," she conceded, surprising both Gregory and herself. "Set up the response team for Reynolds' allegations. I'll brief them in the morning, then take the rest of the day." Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Zoe opened the journal she'd kept since college. Its pages chronicled her journey, the triumphs and setbacks, the moments of inspiration and despair. She began writing about the slap, not as a CEO strategizing a corporate response, but as a woman processing a violation. The words flowed, raw and unfiltered. Tears fell onto the page as she allowed herself to feel the humiliation, the shock, the fury that she'd contained so professionally. By the time she finished writing, the sky was beginning to lighten with dawn's approach. Exhausted but somehow lighter, Zoe finally slept. When she awoke hours later, a clarity had formed around what had started as simply a business acquisition and become something much more significant. This wasn't just about one airline or one incident. It was about creating a template for accountability that could be replicated across industries. It was about using her unique position of power to create change that would benefit those who would come after her, those without billions to shield them, without teams of lawyers to fight their battles. She texted Maya, "We need to think bigger. Beyond Stellar. I have an idea." As Zoe showered and prepared for the day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The personal cost of this fight was real, the emotional labor, the constant vigilance, the isolation of her position. But for perhaps the first time, she fully embraced that the personal was inseparable from the professional in this battle. Her experiences, painful as they were, provided the insight and motivation to drive systemic change. Thomas Reynolds and his desperate allegations would be handled. Stellar Airways would be transformed. But Zoe now saw the potential for something more lasting, a new standard for how corporations address discrimination, not through performative gestures or empty diversity statements, but through structural change with real accountability. As she left her suite, Gregory noted the shift in her demeanor. "Better?" he asked simply. "Clearer," she replied. "Sometimes you need to feel the full weight of something before you can truly address it." "And the weight of this?" he prompted. "Heavy," she admitted. "But not mine alone to carry. That's what I finally understood last night. This isn't just my fight." Gregory nodded, understanding the significance of this evolution in her thinking. "So what's next?" "We finish what we started with Stellar," Zoe said, her voice steady and resolved. "Then we use it as a blueprint for something much bigger." As they rode the elevator down to meet with her team, Zoe felt the familiar mantle of leadership settle back onto her shoulders, but differently now, the burden shared with a community of allies past and present, visible and invisible, who had fought the same battles in their own ways. The personal cost remained real. But so did the possibility of transformation, not just for one company, but for a system that had remained resistant to change for far too long. The Celestial Holdings boardroom buzzed with nervous energy as executives and board members filtered in for what promised to be the most consequential meeting in the company's history. After a week of tumultuous developments, the viral assault video, Zoe Montgomery's revelations about discriminatory practices, Thomas Reynolds' desperate countermeasures, and the public relations war that had consumed financial news cycles, the moment of truth had arrived. Today's meeting would determine not just the future leadership of Stellar Airways, but the very nature of its corporate culture moving forward. The old guard and the new vision were about to face off in a final reckoning. Richard Bennett, still nominally CEO but increasingly aware of his tenuous position, attempted to project confidence as he called the meeting to order. He had spent the past 48 hours desperately trying to position himself as an ally to Zoe's transformation agenda, distancing himself from Reynolds' more extreme resistance tactics. "Before we proceed with the formal acquisition vote," Richard began, "I want to address the unfortunate allegations made by former board member Thomas Reynolds. His claims that Ms. Montgomery somehow orchestrated the incident aboard Flight ST-447 are categorically rejected by current leadership. We have reviewed security footage and numerous witness statements that confirm the events occurred exactly as originally reported." Zoe, seated opposite Richard with her team beside her, acknowledged this statement with a slight nod but remained otherwise impassive. She wore a tailored white suit that contrasted starkly with the dark blue and gray attire favored by most of the executives present, a visual reminder of her different perspective and approach. Furthermore, Richard continued, "We have initiated a comprehensive review of our complaint handling procedures in light of the irregularities discovered in our previous systems. I want to assure the board and our incoming partners at NeuroSync that Stellar Airways is fully committed to transparency and accountability moving forward." The performance might have been convincing to someone who hadn't witnessed Richard's multiple position shifts over the past week, from dismissive damage control to alignment with Reynolds' resistance, and now to champion of reform. Zoe had observed it all with the cool assessment of a chess player watching an opponent make predictable moves. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," Zoe responded when he finished. "Your commitment to reform is noted. However, before we proceed with the acquisition vote, I believe we should address the power play that Mr. Reynolds is attempting from outside this boardroom. Maya Thompson slid folders across the table to each board member. These documents detail Mr. Reynolds' communications with key shareholders over the past 48 hours. He's actively lobbying to block the acquisition unless certain problematic elements, his words, are removed from the transformation plan. Victoria Chang, who had become an unexpected ally to Zoe's vision, reviewed the documents with growing indignation. He's specifically targeting the Independent Oversight Committee and the diverse leadership pipeline. The core elements that would create actual change. Richard Bennett's complexion paled. I assure you, Ms. Montgomery, the board was not aware of, I understand, Zoe interrupted smoothly. Which is why I've taken steps to neutralize this final resistance. She nodded to Diana Chen, who opened her laptop and turned it to face the board. On screen was a compilation of video testimonials from Stellar Airways employees and customers who had experienced discrimination, stories that had been buried by Thomas Reynolds' special protocol. The board watched in stunned silence as person after person described incidents ranging from subtle bias to overt harassment. These testimonials, along with the documented suppression of complaints, have been prepared as a comprehensive report, Zoe explained. It currently sits with 3 entities, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, as there are potential disclosure violations involved. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the implications became clear. However, Zoe continued, the report has not been officially filed. It remains in a holding pattern, contingent on today's decision. Richard Bennett found his voice. This sounds like blackmail, Ms. Montgomery. No, Mr. Bennett. This is accountability. The difference is subtle but significant. Zoe leaned forward. These issues exist whether we acknowledge them or not. These people deserve justice whether it's convenient for Stellar Airways or not. I'm simply making visible what has been deliberately hidden. The remaining Reynolds allies on the board exchanged nervous glances. This was not the move they had anticipated. They had expected demands, threats perhaps, but not the methodical compilation of evidence that could trigger multiple federal investigations. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Harold Blackstone, the operations chief who had been among Thomas's closest allies. Simple. The board votes to approve the acquisition with the full transformation plan intact, no modifications, no delays. In return, these testimonials become part of an internal reconciliation process rather than federal investigations. The past remains in the past, provided the future changes dramatically. Before Harold could respond, Victoria Chang interjected. I move that we vote immediately on the acquisition and transformation plan as originally presented. Second, said another board member quickly, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Richard Bennett, recognizing defeat, called for the vote. The result was unanimous, even Harold and the other Reynolds allies falling in line when they realized the alternative. As the meeting prepared to adjourn, Zoe had one final revelation. There's one more item we should address. Our research into Celestial Holdings' ownership structure revealed something interesting. She turned to Maya, who displayed a complex chart on her tablet. Through various shell companies and investment vehicles, NeuroSync actually secured controlling interest in Celestial Holdings 3 weeks ago. The acquisition was effectively complete before I ever boarded Flight ST-447. The board members stared in disbelief. You mean? Richard Bennett struggled to process this information. I mean that I was already your boss when your employee slapped me, Zoe confirmed calmly. This week's negotiations were never about whether the acquisition would happen. They were about whether Stellar Airways would transform willingly or be dismantled and rebuilt. The stunned silence that followed was broken only when Zoe stood to leave. I'll be making personnel decisions over the coming weeks. Those who demonstrate genuine commitment to our new direction will find opportunities. Those who resist will be invited to seek employment elsewhere. She paused at the door. Starting with you, Mr. Bennett. Your services as CEO end today. As Zoe and her team exited, leaving the shell-shocked executives behind, Gregory Pierce allowed himself a small smile. Checkmate, he murmured. Not quite, Zoe replied quietly. There's one more piece to move. Later that afternoon, Heather Wilson sat nervously in the waiting area outside what had been Richard Bennett's office. She had spent the week in a state of suspended animation, her career destroyed, her future uncertain, her name synonymous with a viral moment of shame. The request to come to headquarters had been unexpected, and no explanation had been offered. When she was finally ushered into the office, she found Zoe Montgomery seated behind the desk, the bruise on her cheek now a faint yellowish reminder of their last encounter. Ms. Wilson, Zoe acknowledged, her expression unreadable. Please sit down. Heather perched anxiously on the edge of a chair. Ms. Montgomery, I don't know what else to say except that I'm deeply, truly sorry. Zoe raised a hand to stop her. I didn't bring you here for more apologies. I brought you here to offer you a choice. She slid a folder across the desk. This is the curriculum for Stellar's new accountability and education program. 6 months of intensive education on the history and impact of systemic racism, coupled with community service work. Participants who complete the program successfully will be considered for reinstatement. Heather stared at the folder, confusion evident on her face. You're offering me a way back. After what I did? Not me, Zoe clarified. The program has independent administrators who will evaluate your progress. But yes, the opportunity exists. Permanent exclusion rarely creates lasting change. This isn't about punishing you, Ms. Wilson. It's about transforming a system that made your actions possible in the first place. Heather's hands trembled as she opened the folder, tears welling in her eyes. Why would you do this? Because, Zoe said simply, this was never about you and me. It's about creating a world where the next generation won't face what I did. And that world isn't built through vengeance, but through transformation, even of those who have caused harm. As Heather left the office, clutching the folder like a lifeline, Zoe turned to look out at the San Francisco skyline. The final piece had been moved. The game was truly over. And a new one, potentially more important, was just beginning. 1 year after the slap that reverberated through corporate America, Stellar Airways no longer existed. In its place stood Horizon Air, its sleek new branding and transformed culture the talk of the industry. The reborn airline featured a diverse leadership team, transparent accountability systems, and consistently high customer satisfaction ratings across all demographic groups. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first 3 months had been particularly challenging as resistant elements within the company either adapted or departed. Some long-time employees couldn't adjust to the new expectations and left voluntarily. Others, who had benefited from the old system of preferences and protected prejudices, were asked to leave. In their place came a wave of new talent, drawn by Horizon's reputation as a company committed to genuine inclusion rather than performative diversity. Applications from qualified candidates of color increased by 300%, allowing the airline to build a workforce that actually reflected the demographics of the customers it served. The accountability and education program, initially created for Heather Wilson, had evolved into an industry-leading approach to addressing discriminatory behavior. Rather than simply firing employees who displayed bias, Horizon offered a pathway to education and redemption for those willing to do the difficult work of confronting their prejudices. Surprisingly, Heather herself had become one of the program's most committed participants and eventually one of its strongest advocates. After completing the 6-month curriculum, she had been reinstated not as a flight attendant but as part of the program's facilitation team, sharing her experience as a cautionary tale and example of transformation. I thought I wasn't racist because I never used slurs or deliberately discriminated, Heather explained to a group of New Horizon employees during orientation. But I had never examined the unconscious biases that affected how I treated people who looked different from me. It took a moment of awful behavior I'm still deeply ashamed of, to force me to confront those biases. The financial results had surprised industry skeptics who predicted the social justice agenda would hurt Horizon's bottom line. In fact, the airline's profits had increased by 17%, customer complaints had decreased by 31%, and employee retention had improved dramatically, reducing costly turnover. Zoe Montgomery had kept her promise to use Horizon as a template for broader change. Through the newly established Montgomery Institute for Corporate Transformation, the model developed at Horizon was being adapted for other industries, creating a framework for companies to address systemic discrimination with concrete, measurable actions rather than empty pledges. On the anniversary of the incident, Zoe found herself on a Horizon flight from New York to San Francisco, the same route where everything had begun. This time, she wasn't traveling incognito. As the CEO of NeuroSync and Horizon's parent company, she was immediately recognized by the crew, but the treatment she received wasn't the nervous deference often shown to powerful executives. Instead, it was the same respectful, attentive service provided to every passenger, regardless of status or appearance. The flight attendant serving her section, a young black woman named Jasmine Roberts, maintained her professional demeanor throughout the flight, neither overcompensating nor underwhelming in her service. It was exactly what Zoe had been fighting for, not special treatment, but equal treatment. As the flight prepared for landing, Jasmine approached Zoe's seat with a young girl in tow, perhaps 11 or 12 years old. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Ms. Montgomery," Jasmine said, "but this young passenger recognized you and asked if she could say hello. I told her I'd have to check if you were available." The girl, with skin a rich brown similar to Zoe's and natural hair styled in neat braids, looked at Zoe with undisguised admiration. "This is Amara," Jasmine introduced. "She's traveling alone to visit her grandparents." "Hello, Amara," Zoe said warmly, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you." Instead of shaking hands, Amara blurted out, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I'm learning coding, and I built my first app last month." Zoe's smile widened. "That's impressive. I didn't build my first app until I was 12. What does your app do?" "It helps my mom organize her work schedule. She has 3 jobs," Amara explained. The parallel to Zoe's own childhood was so striking that she felt a momentary tightness in her throat. "That sounds incredibly useful. And thoughtful. My teacher says girls, especially black girls, don't usually go into computer science," Amara continued, her expression clouding slightly. "But I told her about you, and how you built NeuroSync, and she can't say that anymore." In that moment, Zoe saw the true impact of her work, not just the billions in her bank account or the companies she controlled, but this child who could envision possibilities that previous generations couldn't. A girl who wouldn't have to fight quite as hard for her seat at the table because Zoe and countless others had been widening that table, relentlessly and despite resistance. "Your teacher is working with outdated information," Zoe told Amara gently. "The tech world is changing, just like this airline changed. And people like you are leading that change." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Amara. "This is my personal email. When you turn 16, contact me about our internship program at NeuroSync. We'd be lucky to have someone with your initiative." Amara's eyes widened as she carefully took the card. "Really? You mean it?" "I absolutely mean it," Zoe confirmed. "Just keep building, keep learning, and don't let anyone tell you what you can't do because of how you look." As Amara returned to her seat, clutching the card like a precious talisman, Jasmine thanked Zoe. That meant everything to her. "And to me, seeing it." Zoe nodded. "The real test of our success isn't what happens in boardrooms or quarterly reports. It's whether girls like Amara can move through the world with fewer barriers than we faced." After landing, as Zoe walked through the terminal with Gregory by her side, she reflected on the journey of the past year. The slap that had been meant to put her in her place had instead catalyzed a movement for substantive change. What Thomas Reynolds and his allies had failed to understand was that true power didn't come from maintaining unjust systems, it came from the courage to dismantle them and build something better. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elaine Carter. Saw the quarterly report. Horizons soaring. How does it feel to prove that doing the right thing is also good business? Zoe smiled as she typed her response, like vindication. But more importantly, like progress. The transformation of one airline wouldn't end discrimination in corporate America. The work would continue, facing resistance at every turn from those invested in the status quo. But for the first time, Zoe felt genuinely optimistic about the path forward. As she had told Amara, the world was changing. And sometimes, change began with a single moment, even one as painful as a slap that reminded a billionaire that wealth couldn't shield her from the reality of being a black woman in America. But what mattered most wasn't the blow itself, but what rose from its impact, a new model of accountability, a template for transformation, and a future where perhaps, eventually, such moments would become relics of a past left firmly behind. This story reveals profound truths about systemic racism in America. Even extraordinary wealth and achievement cannot fully shield people of color from discrimination. When Zoe faced the same prejudice that follows many black Americans daily, she chose transformation over vengeance. Her response demonstrates that true change requires addressing root causes, not just punishing individuals. The most powerful approach combines accountability with education and opportunity for growth. The narrative also illustrates how discrimination persists through systems deliberately designed to hide it, requiring strategic dismantling rather than surface-level solutions. Perhaps most importantly, we see that creating lasting change means building pathways for future generations, ensuring they face fewer barriers while equipping them with the tools to continue the work. Has this story resonated with your experiences or observations? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in the power of transformation over punishment, hit that like button. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of accountability and change, please share this video with them. Subscribe to join our community of storytellers and changemakers who believe in creating a more equitable world. Thank you for listening, and remember, real progress happens when we confront uncomfortable truths and commit to building something better together.